Well, it really is a joy for me to spend this time among you. I feel humbled by Val and Stacy's invitation to think that I have anything to share with you. I've already learned so much from you. I do want to say that I think I have never seen more wisely constructed process for enabling people to listen to the Spirit in order to follow their vocations than I am seeing in this Krista Foundation. It's powerful and moving, and it seems to me there is so much wisdom behind it. So I give thanks for that. There is a lot that I would love to explore with you, and it's been really hard to narrow down the path. So I decided to try to put myself in your shoes and see what kinds of challenges that you face, and then see how my life and learning might in some way speak to those. So let me suggest, to begin with, 4 challenges that I imagine are in your lives and that very much have been in mine. One is just this, that the suffering in the world is so great. You encounter it in your service work, and while each of us can do so much, it sometimes feels as though we can do so little, like it's a drop in the bucket. Like, what difference does it make? I think a second is the challenge that, given the endless need in the world and your desire to meet that need and to alleviate suffering, how do you still sustain your own life and enable time for yourself and your loved ones, for your children, for your parents, for your soul, for space to just be? How do you not be consumed up? It seems to me that a third challenge, and this really comes to your generation, well, actually to yours and mine, and that is that we face always with us now the fact that there's something we must do that no one has ever had to do before, that is just brand new for our young and dangerous species, and that is to forge a sustainable relationship between the human species and the planet. That's on your plate now. You and I, our generations, do it, or as one ethicist says, if things continue as they are, we will not. We're an endangered species. But that's something that I see sitting on your shoulders, and I'm imagining that it pervades a part of your consciousness, as I know it does some of my students at NSU. The fourth challenge that I want to name, that I suspect may be one of yours, is the one that probably for me has been the most haunting. And for some of you, this may be a dawning awareness. For some of you, it may be a long-standing awareness. For some of you, it may be yet to come. And that is just the realization, and for me, this comes from being with people on the underside of history, people on the margins of power and privilege. But just the realization that the economic and political and military systems that enable life as we know it are the same systems that exploit, impoverish so many people the world over, and also the earth. For me, that's been hard to bear. I think that reality was expressed most fully and maybe most concisely some years ago when I was leading a group of people to El Salvador for a fact-finding delegation, and we met with, do you know the name John Sobrino, one of the Jesuit priests in the community that was massacred by the military forces in San Salvador. We were sitting in his little office, and he says, in El Salvador, poverty means death, and the people here are not poor by fate or luck. They are poor because the systems that make you rich make them poor. And that stuck there and stayed. And I think that's ever present. So I think those are 4 maybe mind-boggling, possibly soul-shattering realities that are a part of your world. I'd like to share with you just briefly a little bit from my story about how especially the fourth of those, really did become a shattering reality. When I was about, I think, 14, as I look back, I was an officer in the local Luther League. I don't know, how many of you are Lutherans? Luther League is like the youth group. And we had a Luther League, they named it, actually I was just at Gettysburg Theological Seminary, which is a Lutheran theological seminary. I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but Luther League. And there's a brewery across the street from the seminary, and they just had made a new beer, and they're calling it Katie's Delight or something after Martin Luther's wife. Her name was Katie. A lot of beer, so. And they were giving free tastes to all the seminaries. Who knows what the relationship is? Anyway, in Luther League, we had a conference or a convention. I think it was in Port Angeles, and there was a film shown. And the film, if I remember correctly, and I may not, was called Guess Who's Coming to Breakfast? And it was a film that that showed what happened to people in the Dominican Republic, especially the sugar workers, in order to produce the food that came to our breakfast tables. The sugar, and then it went into oranges from other parts of Latin America. And it demonstrated the extraordinary exploitation behind our cheap sugar and our cheap oranges and our cheap bananas, etc. But that film somehow hit my heart, and I think it's because I had been raised, like many of you have, to believe in caring for others, and to believe in a just world, and to want a just world. And to me, it was overwhelming, and I started into some years then of activism. I started with a group called Young World Development, which was part of the American Freedom from Hunger Foundation, which was young people organizing hunger hikes and teach-ins and all kinds of things. But as a couple of years went on, I realized that it felt like it wasn't making any kind of a difference. I also spent 6 weeks in a teach-in in Oakland, California that was also organized by the Lutheran Youth Group that exposed, it was an exposure trip. Maybe one of the early ones, and it exposed us to many issues of poverty in the city. We met with Black Panthers, we met with welfare rights mothers, we met with all kinds of people. And again, there it hit me again, the extent to which their poverty created our wealth in so many ways. Through redlining, through cheap labor, just the underpaid people. So that program was called Operation Survival, and it continued this knowledge in me that has become ever more solidified that the world's systems of injustice are created such that the high consumers of the world are able to have our lifestyles based upon the exploitation of other people. And now we know that the examples of that are all over the place. I spoke already with a couple of people who brought this up to me in our discussions. Stepping away from my 14-year-old self, I'll just move into my current life, and the way that every time I'm with people on the margins, we're talking about, I was working in seminaries around eco-justice issues and with the National Council of Churches, and the discussion of climate change and climate refugees, and the talk that there are 25 million climate refugees now, people displaced by climate. And the point that they would make is that climate change is being caused primarily by the industrialized world, but being suffered by the non-industrialized world. So I could go into stories forever, and I don't want to go into stories forever of that inequity. I want to step back to when I was a teenager and began learning about that. I was alone. I did not have anyone who understood what I was learning. My parents didn't, my friends didn't. And it came to the point, probably a year into that, where I really, and I didn't realize at that point, I was self-despising. I despised my own people because they were doing wrong in the world, and it made me despise myself, which is not a way to live. I remember driving in the backseat of the car on vacation with my family, sitting in the backseat crying. And they couldn't understand why, but it was because I saw what agribusiness was doing. So here's this, they just didn't get it. It is a little, thank you for laughing. but I've always known that I'm not good at making people laugh when I talk, so now I see that that sort of can do it. But I found that I think that a demon, I think many of us, all of us, probably have demons that are self-sabotaging forces. That get in the way of us living out our own beauty and our vocations. And one of mine is that tendency towards the despising of my people and myself. Another way to put it might be, I'm just not good enough. So that demon is there. Another one that I have faced, and I'm being very honest with you, is the demon of despair. Quiet, insidious, almost unconscious, destructive despair that maybe things can't really change for the better on a systemic level. I can do so much for individual people, but on a systemic level, maybe things won't change. So that's a demon of a voice that can be within me. One thing I've learned is that the way to deal with those kinds of voices is not just to put them aside or ignore them, but the way to deal with them, to disarm them, is to pray fervently, to beseech God for help and protection, and then to face them, to name them, to see them clearly, face them, be in community, and talk them down. So I'd just like to say that I speak to you today in part against those particular demons, if they inhabit your life, but also related voices or ways that you take in the world in ways that might sabotage your ability to love yourself and give back. Are you with me there? Ways that you may sabotage your own vocation. I'd like to tell you two things that happened for me that really restored my hope, and I think may have saved my life, one of them. One of them was, I was by this time in college, and I'd come home to Tacoma, where I lived. I grew up in Iowa and then Tacoma. And I knew that I needed help. And I went to see a man, something led me to see a man who had been the youth leader in my church. He was a dentist. He did not have necessarily the kind of consciousness of the world I had, but he had a deep love and a deep compassion. And I went to him. And I don't know what I said, but he looked at me and he closed down his dentist office. He just like taped up someone's teeth and sent them out the door. I mean, it was that fast. And he took me out to a creek someplace, and we sat by the creek, and he read to me from the book of Romans. I cannot today repeat to you which verses because I don't recall, but it spoke to me in the most powerful way that I'll never ever forget. And what it spoke to me was that I was beloved. That God loved me with a profound love that would stop by nothing, that was unstoppable. And I remember the light of that love shining on me, and I remember basking in that for almost a week, realizing, I remember thinking I could sit like a bump on a log for the rest of my life. I remember those words, and God would love me as much as if I saved the world. So it was a beautiful. So I carry that. I haven't repeated that degree, that intensity of that knowledge, but I've understood through my own study and understanding that you hold on to when you have that kind of knowledge. A second thing happened. I knew I needed to talk to someone that knew a lot about injustice, inequity, exploitation in the world, but who maintained a sense of hope and joy. So I went to see a pastor, a Lutheran pastor in Seattle. His name was John Nelson. Does anyone know that name? John Nelson was the father of, he had adopted 13 kids. He and his wife, they were all special needs kids. He was full of laughter. No one knows him. He's dead now, actually. Bless his heart. He was really something. He was out there. I don't know where you stand on nuclear weapons, but he was out there in the protests against the nuclear weapons and the Trident nuclear submarine base. You know what that is? It's out here near Seattle. And his mother was out there protesting with him, and she was over 80. And she was out there on a boat, and little boat, and the Coast Guard comes, and the Coast Guard is going to squirt down the people in the little boats because the protesters weren't supposed to be in the canal. And this old woman stood up with an American flag and she said, "Not in my America, you won't." And they didn't swear down the bones. You got a lot of power for your protest. But anyway, I went to see John. And I said to him, "How do you maintain this sense of joy and hope, knowing what you know about the world?" And he said, and maybe these weren't his words, but this is the words that I remember. He said, "You know, Cindy, I know the end of the story." And he meant the resurrection hope. He meant that ultimately the world was in God's hands and God was going to create abundant life for all. And that has stayed with me. That is my food. I know the end of the story. So my life moved on after that. After graduating from college, I did go to Honduras, Central America, for 2 years and worked with a health program that we had a clinic, but we also went up and worked with midwives, parteras, up in the mountain villages and health promoters, and it was very rich and incredible, and I learned so much during that time. I also learned, and it was reinforced to me again, the way some people's wealth is built on others' poverty. I remember the women that I worked with, their kids were hungry, and all they needed was un pedacito de tierra, a little piece of land to grow food. But the land was owned by foreign landowners to, in this case around there, to grow cattle for export. So it kind of reinforced that, and I realized that my work, my vocation was to come back to the United States and try to make a difference here in the way the United States related to the rest of the world and economic justice within the U.S. So I did return, and I did an MSW, Master's of Social Work, and worked in human services for some time, which I loved, but I knew I needed to work on Central America. So I started job hunting. My husband was a pastor, and he was willing to move, and I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. to direct the East Coast office of something called the Center for Global Education, which is a program that takes people on immersion experiences, incredibly life-changing experiences in places in the world where the U.S. is involved and where there's conflict and such. I say that because my service with impoverished people continued to present me with that challenge of the hugeness of the world's suffering. The knowledge that I couldn't solve it all, and this knowledge of some of that suffering being constructed by the life that I and my people lived. The descendants of the tribes of Europe have done a lot in the world that creates wealth for us and takes from others. David Tracy, the theologian, does anyone know the name David Tracy, Roman Catholic theologian? He said once at a talk at SU, he said, "To be human is to suffer knowing that we create suffering. We are haunted by that suffering." Well, needless to say, I wrote that down. It seems to me, though, that knowing we create suffering is not new. Knowing we create the magnitude of suffering in the world today, particularly when you look at climate change, is new. We're the first people. This was, does anyone know Sharon Parks Dallos? She was one of the people, I understand, who helped to envision the Krista Foundation. I learned that this morning. She said once, "We are the first generation in human history to know that we affect the survival of millions of species and millions of people." That is a weighty thing to hold. And what strikes me is that human beings have always learned from our ancestors, but we don't have any ancestors that have faced this issue. We don't have people in generations before us who can tell us how to do that, how to face having that kind of power. So, that said, to name some of what I see as challenges of being a person of compassion and caring in this world today who wants to do something about it, you might ask, how do I live into the future with hope and with joy? How do I face what someone has called the data of despair and not drown in it? And so what I would like to do is just share with you a few clues that I have grown to know and to understand They are sources of hope for me, and you may see them as such, but maybe they will also turn out to be sources of hope and moral power for you. One of them, and I think this kind of goes back to the image at the creek, has to do with who we are. And I've learned to try to see myself as I am in the eyes of God. And see everyone else as they are at the creek. But speaks to me. In fact, this text, I finally decided, I told my boys, I think they need to start memorizing biblical texts. And they said, why? And I said, well, sometime you could be a place where there is no Bible. And you could be in really, really big distress. What if you're in prison? I didn't mean for crimes, I meant for protest. And I said, you could be in prison and there's no Bible. And how would you be able to drink what you could drink from the Bible? And Gabe said, Mom, I'd ask for a Bible. Well, that sounded reasonable, but I said I thought they should, at the very least, learn one biblical text. And this is what I wanted them to learn. And lo and behold, the next day, one of our best friends from a package arrived from one of our best friends in Washington, D.C., like a sister to me. And it was a beautiful, she's a physician that works with Amish and Mennonite people and a lot of low-income people who don't have money, and they pay her an artwork often. And it was a beautiful quilted thing with this text quilted into it. It's the text that says, I am convinced that nothing can separate us from God's love in Jesus Christ our Lord. Not death or life, nor angels or rulers, not present things or future things, not powers or height or depth or any other thing that is created. So, to me, that is a statement of being beloved by a love that will not cease. And to me, it's a source of hope. So a second source has to do with why we exist. That is why we are here on earth anyway. For many decades, that shows how old I am, for many decades I thought that we were here to love neighbor as self, and particularly to love neighbor with God's justice-making love. Where neighbor was oppressed by systemic oppression, that love was to seek to dismantle it. So love for white people is to help dismantle white privilege. Love for people of economic privilege is to help dismantle economic exploitation. And that our job is to love, not only in those ways, also to love interpersonally, to love profoundly that way, but our call was to love neighbor as self. So I realized after some time that that's part of our call. But I realized that we are called first to receive and trust the love of God. That we're called to receive and trust the love of God. And then to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. To love self and neighbor as self. And to love all of creation. I realized that's why we're here. But it's not the only reason we're here. And I think we're called to something else. And this is more recent in my life. And then I won't say more about what we're called to do, why we're here, because that's a lot. To receive the love and then to love it out again. But I think we're also called, we're beckoned, and we are empowered to, let me take that back again. When it comes to receiving the love of God, I think that God empowers us to live that love into the world. I think that we're here to let that love work through us and in us and among us to create abundant life for all. And I think we're here to relish and delight in being creatures in an incredible garden that is splendid beyond our imagining. I think we're here to be fed by the sensuous pleasure of this earth. And that means so many things. It means this. You know, you went outside today. And this feeds us. It means for me in the morning when I do I go running every morning, but it's not really a run, it's like a 15-minute lope. I don't call myself a runner, but I run every day for a long time. But when I run, I go up there, and lo and behold, there's this misty grayness all over that just feels like it's moistening me. And then there are the scents. So in the springtime as I run, I go and I smell. Every time I see an iris or a lilac, I stop and I smell them. And I feel that wind on my skin. And I think that's part of, I just don't think God would have created such a sensuous world. We have these 5 senses if we weren't meant to take incredible pleasure in them, including the pleasure of touch. I think what would happen if every human being got a really good back rub every day? You know, I do not think we would have wars. So I think that's part of why we're here. Like, we're mammals, we're on this earth, and we're meant to enjoy. So that sense of who we are is a second source of hope for me. Not of who we are, of why we're here. There's a third source, and it's what I call a paradoxical moral anthropology. By that, you know, a moral anthropology is who we are as moral beings, who the human being is as a moral being. And paradoxical, obviously, is that there's a paradox inherent in who we are. On the one hand, we're who I just described. We are beloved creatures of God. We are treasured. There's an image, and I'd like to share it with you that I hold of how we are beloved and then molded by God to live love into the world. It's an image that is provided by a 2nd century theologian, Irenaeus of Lyon. He was a leader of one of the martyred communities in the 2nd century. And he has an image. His word, when you translate, I did not translate his Greek, by the way, but I've read good translators of his Greek. He calls the human being the mud creature. We're the mud creature. And we're the mud creature partly because we're made from soil. Adam means, maybe you all know this, Adam is out of the word Adamah, which means dust or soil, just like human is connected to humus, the earth. So we're made from soil. But according to Irenaeus of Lyon, and this is in his writings, he says, the dew of the Holy Spirit dispersed throughout all the earth is moistening us. The dew of the Holy Spirit dispersed throughout all the earth is moistening us so that the dust becomes mud, so we're mud creatures, and then the 2 hands of God, word and wisdom, or Son and Spirit, are molding the mud creature into ever more union and communion with God. So it's an image I hold. It's an incredible image of who I am. Needless to say, I let my kids get very muddy when they were children, just kind of in honor of being a mud creature. But it's very, so that's one of who we are. At the same time, that's not all who we are. I mean, you look at the 20th century in itself, and you realize that human beings are not just creatures being molded and shaped. We're also profoundly alienated from God, from the earth, from one another. We're captive to what Martin Luther calls, his word for sin is selves curved in on self. Se in curvatus ense. Curved in on self-interest as individuals, but as a society. We are participants in systemic exploitation of so many kinds. So we are beloved creatures, loving creatures, and at the same time, we are participants in tremendous systemic evil. Now, you might wonder why that's hope-giving. That, to me, it's hope-giving. It helps me know that even though I'm implicated by being white, I'm implicated in a society that vastly privileges whiteness. By having my food and my clothing, it's been gotten through many ways that means that I would not justify. I'm implicated, but that does not mean that I'm not also a person capable of infinite love, bearing the Spirit of God. For me to know that I'm both, because I can't fully escape the one, but that does not overpower or obliterate the other. Do you understand what I'm saying? For me, that has been very important to know. The fourth, you can tell I am sort of a professor, like it's 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to give you 6 sources of hope. The fourth is the resurrection. I think that despair can be sown by a deep sense that things will continue as they are in this world. I believe that the cross and the resurrection promise otherwise. That the power of God liberating all of creation from the bonds of oppression and destruction and death is stronger than all the forces that would undermine God's promise that all will have life and have it abundantly. We have heard the end of the story. Thank you, John Nelson, from my perspective. And it is resurrection. Soul-searing, life-shattering destruction and death is not the last word in this moment or forever, in some way that we do not grasp. And it is difficult to grasp if you take seriously the realities of climate change. But in some way that we do not grasp, the last word is life raised up out of brutal death. In the midst of suffering, be it individual suffering, be it social, be it ecological, there is a promise. And that promise is that life in God will reign. God in Christ and the Spirit is restoring the earth community and will redeem human beings from living as enemies of the earth community. God's future for creation is abundant life for all. That is the message, or a message, of the resurrection to me. I hold that before me when I see the cross. I think it has to be said that that particular message can also be a dangerous one. I've been told this, that it can leave people all in God's hands and we can step back. How many people know the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Okay, good. Bonhoeffer was a leader of the resistance against fascism in Germany. He has taught me on this. He has this dialectic. It's an incredible dialectic between absolute trust in the absolute trust in God, that God will reign. He holds that, and at the same time he has a practically brutal critique of liberal Christianity's idea that God is kind of a fix-it machine, that God will take care of it. So I'll quote to you from him. He says, "I believe that God can and will bring good out of evil, even out of the greatest evil. For that purpose, God needs people. I believe that God will give us all the strength we need to help us to resist evil in all times of distress." So he believes that life in God will reign, but that we cannot see God as what he calls a machine for fixing life's problems. He insists that God's power on behalf of the world is located in God's embodied presence in human responsible actions on behalf of life in the world. So I think bearing that in mind can keep it from being dangerous to say that the world is in God's hands and God's love for the world will reign in the end. Does that make sense? Yeah? There's a fifth source of hope that I've understood to be very much a part of my life. And you could call it community. Where it hit me in a certain way that grasped me was in reading Bonhoeffer's Life Together, which is his story of life in the resistance seminary in Germany. And he uses the word miteinander. I don't speak German, so this is without a German accent. Miteinander and füreinander, meaning we're not only for the other, but with the other. and that we're for the other because we're with the other. And that being with, that is being in community, is what feeds us to be able to be for the other. I am pretty sure that, I am absolutely sure that we are utterly independent creatures. Utterly dependent, interdependent creatures. Like, you couldn't breathe for a minute if it weren't for all of those little animals that live inside your body. Like, where do they live? In the tear ducts, in the intestines, in our skin, in our hair. We're virtually crawling with little animals. We're so dependent upon those little animals. You would not have the incredible power that I see in you if it weren't for other people that have helped nourish that power in you. I think that you're aware of that. I want to toss out another image that has become very important to me, and it's a biblical image. And it's the image of the cloud of witnesses. Because I think that we are interdependent not only on the people that have directly shaped us, or the creatures that provide our life, but also on people that have come long before and people in the future. I believe that time doesn't necessarily exist in a linear way, and that we are still fed by Irenaeus of Lyon and the people throughout time who have sought to realize God's love in the world. I think that it would behoove us to think about the community of resistance of which we are a part in the church. Maybe to teach our little kids that they are part of a community, of a heritage of resistance. Am I running out of time? How much time do I have? 15? 10? 5? 10. 10. 10, 5. All right, let's see. Okay, I think I can do it in 5. I wasn't going to say this, but I just thought I'd add a little something here about teaching our kids. I don't know if they learned in Sunday school that about the midwives that resisted Pharaoh, and on up, and the resistors of slavery, the resistors of the early martyrs that resisted imperial Rome. And I think that if we teach them that, it might give them more power. And I have a little example. We called a new family and youth minister in our church some time ago. A beautiful, very Jesus-loving woman. A very gentle woman. Her name is Ann Hall. So, she's up there giving one of her first sermons. So she's the youth and family and children's minister. And she goes, well, it was about Paul in prison. I could empathize with Paul in prison, in shackles, in solitary confinement, because the last time I was in prison, I was in solitary confinement with shackles. So the people start to go, what is this? But it turns out that she had been in prison a number of times for non-violent resistance to various things, mostly war. And I thought, and now she takes the little kids and she takes them to Campbell Farm to do their mission trips and everything. And so this is a good presence. And it's an example of teaching that kind of thing. Okay, in 5 minutes, a sixth wellspring of hope to me. That is what I call critical mystical vision. And that is trying to see 3 things at once. One of them is seeing what is going on around us. And that means being willing to dare to see the systemic causes of people's suffering. Secondly, however, never to do that. Not to do that without seeing a couple of other things. And one of those is, so not only what could be and is becoming. The forces, the people on earth throughout the continents that are working toward a more just and compassionate world. We do not see that as well in this country as it is visible in many other continents. But to bear that in mind. And third, to see the power and presence of God coursing throughout all of creation and working within all of creation. It has been really quite astounding to me to realize that there is an ancient faith claim that God not only indwells us, but indwells all of the created world. Now, I'm going to read you one person who's not known for saying that. and who has it in his writings all over the place, and that's Martin Luther. I never learned this. Through seminary, nothing. But he writes, "The power of God must be essentially present in all places, even in the tiniest leaf. God is present in every single creature, in its innermost and outermost being. God is in and through all creatures, in their parts and all their places, so that the world is full of God, and God fills all. Christ fills all things." Okay, that's very powerful. But then you take something else he said, and that is that the Word of God, wherever it comes to change and renew the world. So if I think about that, and this I've been trying to do for a couple of years now, if God in some way that we modern human beings don't know is living within the created world, what kind of power is there to feed us and nourish us in our hope and in our ability to have moral spiritual power for the good on this earth? How can we hear? And I think that is one of the charges of the church in the current time, to learn to hear the power and presence of God indwelling all things, even the tiniest leaf. Well then, those are a few wells from which I draw hope and life, and a sense that whatever challenges I face, there is a reality that is greater, and that reality ultimately will bring about the great shalom for all. We are called to allow that sacred reality to dwell within us and among us, and to guide our lives. So thank you for hearing a little bit of my story, and I hope to share more and hear more of yours as the day goes on.
Thank you, Cynthia. That's wonderful. Well, it's time for us to take a break and go play and experience the outdoors and the beauty and joy